Hey YouTube, One True Church here. This video is a continuation of my last video. My last video I did was I showed from Martin Luther's own words that he was a heretic and that much of what he said contradicted to what Christ said in the scriptures. We showed how Martin Luther rejected the idea of free will. He believed that God is the author of evil. He condoned polygamy. He, one point, he taught that Christ fornicated, and that's where we left off on the last one. But this video is going to deal with Martin Luther's heresies against Holy Scripture, and by that I mean his denial of certain books which the Catholic Church has always considered to be part of the canon. Luther kicked out 7 books of the Old Testament called the deuterocanonical books, and one of the reasons why he probably did that was because Maccabees makes a clear reference to purgatory and prayers for the dead, something which Martin Luther explicitly rejected. Now I know there's a big debate between Protestants and Catholics over this issue. If you look at some ancient councils in the late 4th, early 5th century, councils of Rome, Hippo, Carthage, the decree of Pope Innocent I, you'll see that they use the same Old Testament canon as Catholics do today. But that's for a different video that I might do in the future over the deuterocanonical books. Let's concentrate on the books, though, that Catholics and Protestants both have in common, the New Testament. Luther questioned the inspiration of some of those books as well, and I think this is very relevant because I know many Protestants today are very devoted to the Bible, which is a great thing. What many of them don't realize is that many of the books which they held sacred, their founder Martin Luther rejected. Let's give you an example. In Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 through 19, it says, "For I testify to everyone that hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If any man shall add to these things, God shall add him to the plagues written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the prophecy of this book, God shall take away his part out of the book of life, and out of the holy city, and from these things that are written in this book." So God clearly says, Jesus says, in Revelation chapter 22, verses 18 through 19, that if you add or remove anything from the book of Revelation, he's going to remove you from the book of life and you'll go to hell. Well, Luther did worse than that. Luther removed, or at least called into question, the inspiration of the entire book of Revelation. He said, "To my mind, the book of the Apocalypse, or Revelation, bears upon it no marks of an apostolic or prophetic character. Everyone may form his own judgment of this book. As for myself, I feel an aversion to it, and to me this is sufficient reason for rejecting it." So notice that he doesn't just say that everyone may form his own judgment on the book, which would be bad enough because to even doubt a teaching of the faith is heresy, but he then goes on to say that I have sufficient reason for rejecting it. So Luther is basically rejecting the book of the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. So if Jesus said, if you even remove from this book, from the contents of this book, you'll be accursed. Imagine what's going to happen. What happened to Luther? He tried to reject the entire book. Luther tried to add to the Bible as well. He added the word alone to Romans 3:28. For many of you who don't know, one of the passages in Scripture which Protestants try to quote in order to teach justification by faith alone is Romans 3:28, which says, "See that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law." Now, this verse does not teach sola fide. It's what Paul is saying in that verse is, we are justified by faith apart from works of the law, meaning the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law. He's saying that you no longer need to follow the Old Testament and the works of the Mosaic law, that you can just become a Christian. And we know this because later on in the same chapter he talks about circumcision. So Paul is not excluding all works from our justification. He's only excluding works of the law, of the Old Testament Mosaic law. And I think Martin Luther recognized this because he added the word alone to that passage. Instead of saying, see that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law, Martin Luther changed it to say, see that a man is justified by faith alone apart from works of the law, completely changing the meaning of that passage. The way it was written originally in the original Greek was not teaching sola fide, just faith apart from the Old Testament law. But Martin Luther, by adding the word alone, completely changes the meaning of the passage. And here's what he said about it. If your papist annoys you with the word alone from Romans 3:28, tell him straight away Dr. Martin Luther will have it so. Papist and ass are one and the same thing. Whoever will not have my translation, let him give it the go-by. The devil thanks to him who censors it without my will and knowledge. Luther will have it so, and he is the doctor above all the doctors in popedom. Luther not only clearly displaying his arrogance here, but also he's basically saying, yeah, I added the word alone to the passage. What are you going to do about it? So, it just shows just the nature of Martin Luther. Another thing he did to help support his doctrine of justification by faith alone was to attempt to throw out the book of James. The book of James, especially the second chapter, is a complete antithesis to salvation by faith alone. Especially the 24th verse, which says, see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Not by faith alone. The only passage in all of Scripture where the words faith and alone appear together is James chapter 2, verse 24, and it says we are not saved by faith alone. So it's no wonder that Luther wanted to get rid of this book of James, because it completely runs contrary to his teachings. Here's what he said about it. He said, we should throw the epistle of James out of this school, Wittenberg, for it doesn't amount to much. It contains not a syllable about Christ. Not once does it mention Christ except at the beginning. I maintain that some Jew wrote it who probably heard about Christian people but never encountered any. So he insults the apostle James, telling him that he's not a Christian, and that he probably never encountered any Christian people, which is completely ridiculous. And talks about throwing out the epistle of James from his school. And he said other quotes about James. He talked about throwing him into the stove and passages like that. I didn't put in this presentation, but if you want to look it up, just check out the sources that I provided in my last video. Look it up on the internet. Luther clearly was needed to do this in order to support his doctrine of justification. And this should raise an eyebrow for Protestants who are devoted to the Bible, because if Luther had to add and remove from the Bible to get it to say what he wanted it to say in order for Scripture to support his teaching, how can his teaching be biblical? I mean, think about it. If the Catholic Church did this to support one of its doctrines which Protestants disagree with, they would never let us live it down. Really, they would be throwing it in our face 24/7, and yet their founder, Martin Luther, added and removed from the Bible to teach justification by faith alone. Clearly, justification by faith alone must not be biblical if Luther had to resort to this. And I think what's really deceptive is that Luther is portrayed today as being a hero of the Bible, as someone who revealed to the world what the Bible truly teaches and reclaimed the gospel. It's completely ridiculous when one sees what Luther tried to do with the book of Revelation, with Romans, and with James. So I think it's just very, very revealing. Now, Luther's fellow Protestants eventually urged him not to do this, not to throw out the book of James, because it would be too radical and people wouldn't take them seriously. But I think Luther's words really convict him here, and I think that it's something that we should take into account when we think about his teaching, sola fide and sola scriptura. If Luther was wrong about these things, what else could he be wrong about? And the next video I'm going to do is on sola fide and show how he was completely wrong on this issue. Until next time, God bless.